Hello, everyone. How are you? I hope everything is okay considering the situation we're facing right now. As you see, I decided to keep on with the beach theme for a while. Hopefully, it will cheer us up a little bit more considering what we're facing over the last few weeks and what's coming in the upcoming weeks. If you have other suggestions, as always, you're welcome to send them to me. Now, two things quickly before I start today's lecture. In terms of attendance, it seems to be working pretty well so far. If you missed previous lectures or if you watch them in delay, it means you're not watching them on the day that I'm uploading them to the YouTube page. Just don't forget to email me the attendance board so I can mark your attendance. I'm usually doing it about a day or two behind after I'm posting the lectures. So just don't forget to do that before once you view the videos. One more thing, as I promised you before we left for spring break and unfortunately never came back, extra credit assignment is ready. I will send you an email later today with the instructions. I want to emphasize two important things, which I'll also write in the email, but I wanted to also talk about it to make sure that you are aware of that. First of all, you will have to write your first name, last name, and your UIN. The only reason we collect this information for the survey is anonymous. So the only reason we collect this information is because I need to know who completed the survey so I can give you the extra credit. So we do not use this information for the study. So you should not be worried about that. Once I compile the list with the participants for the survey, I just delete your personal information. It has nothing to do with the survey itself, so you shouldn't worry about that. You're gonna also be asked to fill in the class number, so you'll just fill in, make sure that you click on the right class number so I'll be able to find you, because other students are also filling the survey. One last thing, we are able to monitor everything that you do in this survey. So one of the things that are important for us that you will take it seriously. It should take you anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. It's going to be reading instructions, answering a couple of questions, seeing a video of about 3.5 minutes, and then answering a few more questions. Overall, again, somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes. If you want to get the extra credit, what we ask you is to be serious. We are able to monitor everything that you do. So if somebody just rushes over, clicks without even reading and finishing everything in like 3.5 minutes, we will know you did not take it seriously. You will not get the extra credit. So please make sure that you do that properly. You'll get the link later today and along with the instructions. All right. So I want to start today as usual. Today we begin the week throughout this entire week. I'm going to talk about different aspects related to counterterrorism. But before we do that, as usual, we'll do a quick review. On Friday's lecture, I finished the part talking about money and sponsoring, but talking more specifically about financing of terrorism, the need to identify the most effective way to generate income and to move money around in order to support the terror operations. I've mentioned a few times that this is a relatively underexplored issue. There's still not a lot of theoretical discussions on that. So it's still a very, very underexplored issue. When we talked about the paper that you had to read for the lecture, there was a different ways to assess the method of financing. First of all, talking about what is the volume of the transfers, the risks that are involved, and the potential cost. Then I've mentioned the various methods, the direct methods such as couriers, the informal methods such as the hawalas, how the benefits that those kinds of methods, especially in the places where they're already established, provide us. The more official money service businesses and banks, and the cost for using those kinds of methods, as well as others. And then I went into a short discussion about the relationship between terror organizations and criminal organizations, the incentives of both sides in order to preserve this cooperation. Then we talked about the paper from last year that showed that countries which are relatively weak in terms of capacity have larger shadow economies, which is the informal economy, part of the economy. The larger that part of the economy is, the more likely it is there's going to be cooperation between criminal organizations and and terror organizations. Of course, if you have any questions about it, as always, you're welcome to send them to me. So today, as I said, we'll start talking about counterterrorism. So there's a lot of counterterrorism methods for countries, and each has its own link to some kind of theoretical approach, and we'll get to that part also later in this week. The main puzzle that we're asking here is trying to understand which policy measure, which type of counterterrorism policy is more successful than others. And a lot of the research is focusing on the questions, why do some measures work under some circumstances and why they fail in others? Overall, in terms of employing different measures of terrorism, so there's a lot of variation among actors. In terms of differences with respect to the type and the amount of measures that are used, how discriminate are the policy action, and that means mostly that do those measures target specific suspect terrorists or those who already conducted effects of terrorism, and that's the focus of the policy, or is it less as an indiscriminate policy which focuses on the entire population, which not necessarily have suspects of terrorism yet? So that's the general question. So before we go into talking about the different methods of counterterrorism, we'll do some introduction. As always, we always talk about beginning with some kind of definition. So the definition is what you have here on the screen: the practice, tactics, techniques by which various agencies of the state are implementing the prevention and the fight of terrorism. There are multiple actors involved in the implementation of different counterterrorism policy. It's mostly a top-down approach, which means it comes from the top of the government, the president, prime minister, whatever that is, the cabinet, and moves down to the different agencies and organizations that belong to the government. That involves military forces, law enforcement forces. It includes, of course, intelligence agencies. It includes also things in the community level, such as community groups and private sector members. All may be part of the war, maybe part of the policy in a joint, kind of a joint actions, or independently they work together. So that's the definition, and that's what counterterrorism policies is overall related to. A little bit about the history. So the first known counterterrorism uses what was called the ISB, which is the Irish Special Branch. It was established by the British in the 1880s. As a response to the growing violence of Irishmen who fought to end the British rule of Ireland. The main approach that the ISB used was infiltration and subversion. The role expanded to serve as a security force against any kind of external threat that the British have faced, mostly those that were viewed as terrorism. And 9/11, as I've said in many different examples throughout the lectures when we had them in class and when I had them here online, was a watershed moment which made counterterrorism a national security issue, not just here in the United States, which was the main victim of 9/11, but from a more global perspective. So that's a little bit background. Now, one of the things that sometimes is being confused is questions about counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. So some view counterterrorism as part of the overarching effort of counterinsurgency. That's this COIN short term for counterinsurgency. It's mostly related to those that view terrorism as one tactic that is adopted by different insurgent groups. So if you see insurgent groups using terrorism as one tactic, so counterterrorism is one part of an overall counterinsurgency policy. But it's important to distinguish between those terms. So for the definition of counterinsurgency, it's what you have here on the screen, which is a pretty long one: different military, economic, civic, and other actions that are intended to protect the population, and more important than that, even restore the legitimacy of the government. Terrorism, in this case, is a little bit different. So let's look at different types of policies after 9/11. So counterterrorism after 9/11 focused mostly on intelligence operations, preventing the financial flow of money into terror organizations, and implementing many different defensive measures. At the same time, the counterinsurgency policy after 9/11 was mostly intended to eradicate the terrorism threat altogether, includes the removal of the Taliban from power, establishing a government that will be more capable of preventing terrorism and be more friendly to the United States, which in turn required a substantial unilateral military intervention by many nations led by the United States. So overall, what we see here that the overall objective of fighting terrorism, both for counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, is the same, but the difference to implement those policies are not the same. So that's the main difference between them. So before going into the different methods, one of the important aspects we need to talk about when we talk about terrorism, counterterrorism, especially from a research standpoint, is how to measure success. Why is that? Because the investment in counterterrorism is very, very large. In the late 1990s, the United States budget with respect to counterterrorism was somewhere around $7 billion. By the middle 2000, it was actually almost close to $100 billion. So the investment is enormous. And in this case, it means that it is crucial to assess how effective is the policy. It means how successful that is. The challenge in this case is the fact that counterterrorism campaigns or counterterrorism policy as a whole involves a lot of different measures, and those measures are sometimes focusing on very different goals. So some address the early risk factors of radicalization of individuals. Some focus on the prevention of attacks in specific contexts, and some are even talking about what's called the post-attack factors, such as stress by the victims or the population as a whole, PTSD and stuff like that. So there's different measures used to focus on those different goals, so it's hard to really make one general assessment of the policy. One of the ways that that researchers have addressed this challenge is to look at counterterrorism with the context of success and break down questions of effectiveness based on four broad categories, which in a way reflect the objectives of counterterrorism. So let's start with that, go over them one by one. The first is the focus on measures that are intended to reduce or decrease the extent of attacks, as well as the damages in both property, as well as the number of casualties from terror attacks. The measures are mostly defensive measures, which are focusing on the protection of specific locations, airport agencies, embassies, and stuff like that, or focusing on countering specific group. And of course, if the measures in a certain location or versus a specific group are successful, we can say that the policy is effective. Now, a little bit from the research evidence when we're focusing on this one way of measuring success or effectiveness. So this is the first study is a study that was based on the counterterrorism policy of Canada, 1985 to 2013. This is a study from 2016. They found that overall, the more aggressive the policy is, the extent of attacks are actually increases. So the way that they defined the policy, the Canadian policies over that time, was there were domestic policies, which involved a lot more restrictions within the Canadian borders. The global aspect of the policy was the fact that Canada joined the NATO forces in Afghanistan. They also, but at the same time, while they showed that more aggressive policy led to more extreme attacks, they found that since 2010, the combination of both domestic and a global strategy actually led to a drop in the extent of attacks. So the findings in this case are mixed. Now, another study we have is also from 2016. This is again coming back to our old friend Martha Crenshaw, along with others. They studied what were the main methods that were used in the counterterrorism policy to prevent attacks here in the United States. They showed a total of about 80% of the attacks here in the US were either fully or partially foiled, and the methods vary, but the ones who was most powerful in this case, and this is the breakdown that you have this in the paper, was different combination of internal information and surveillance methods. Family tip-off, community tip-off, if we join all those things together, so this is surveillance, and this is informants, we have here almost 75%. If you add to that the family and community tip, we get to a very high number of getting information from someone in the field that was able to allow to curb those attacks. So this is a method that was very successful according to this policy. This is one of the most successful ways that we can reduce attacks and reduce the damages if some of those attacks actually takes place. So that's the first way to conceptualize the effectiveness of counterterrorism policy and the results. Another objective which allows us to measure the effectiveness of the policy is whether the objective is to destroy the group, but this has to be viewed as whether the measures that we are using increase the likelihood that the group demises or decides to shift its focus away from violence as a form of political contention. The main method that's used in this case, the main measure that is used in this case is what's called leader decapitation or targeted killing, using military powers in order to kill the leaders of terror groups or leading figures in the terror groups. There's a lot of studies about that. I've mentioned that a few times in past lectures, and we'll keep talking about it for the rest of this week a lot. So a little bit of the evidence for that. So Jana Jordan, who's a scholar from Georgia Tech, I think, University, did a lot of research on that. So one of her studies in 2009, she first of all looked at the different. She looked at how to first of all define what does it mean to destroy the group, to demise the group. So the way that she defined that was that the group was either inactive for at least about 2 years after the leader was killed. And what she found was that for a smaller, younger group, this method of leader decapitation is effective. But those groups who are religious groups are actually much more resilient to those kinds of measures. Now, overall, when you look at the entire spectrum of groups, she found that it was less than 20% successful in showing a decline of groups. So the use of this kind of policy, killing the leaders, was not very successful. What her main conclusion was that it's not a very effective strategy, especially if the goal is to end the group's tenure. Now, this leads us to think about, let's take one step up the ladder of abstraction and think about how did she define the demise of a group, and that leads us to other studies in that. So this is, for example, is a study by Price, which emphasizes how important it is to understand how do we conceptualize and measure success. So according to Jordan, success was that the group was inactive for either for the foreseeable future or for about 2 years. Now, Price rejected her. He criticized her work for choosing a relatively short time lag, which was 2 years for that. He adopts a much longer range of analysis, and he assesses the mortality rate for groups. He overall finds that leader decapitation actually increases the rate of mortality for groups, so leader decapitation is an effective policy. He also finds that religious groups are not as resilient as much as Jordan found. It's easier to destroy religious groups compared to, especially when you compare them to nationalist groups. Some of the additional interesting findings he showed that was that when the decapitation happens relatively early in the lifespan of the group, then the success chances for leading to the group's demise are much higher, which in a way complements some of what Jordan said. But again, we thought about it in a much more longer span of time. So it complements part of it, but it also rejects some of it. An important thing that he was able to show is that any type of leader turnover increases the likelihood of the group's demise, which means it doesn't have to be getting rid of the leader by killing him. It can be other methods. So if we're using apprehend the leaders or use police forces or military enforcement, military forces to just capture them and put them in prison, it's another way that we can lead to the demise of the group. It doesn't necessarily have to be killing the leaders. So that's another study in this aspect. There are two more ways to conceptualize success. So one of them is looking at containment. The goal is to restrict the group's actions to a specific place, to a specific type of technology. And the main measures and the main evidence for this kind of goal is the successful, so far, efforts to prevent access of terror groups and use, of course, of what's called CBRN weapons, which overall is chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. We'll get to chemical and nuclear terrorism next week, but this is one effort for that. The last way to think about that is to address normative values. In this case, is the idea of how much effort we are exerting in protecting or addressing terrorism threat, but do we also maintain the core values, especially in the context of democracy? And that involves the trade-off that I've already mentioned when I talked about the national security, civil liberties dilemma, right? A policy may be successful in preventing attack or capturing terrorists or stopping them or killing them in that matter, but does it also preserve the norms and the values that society, especially a democratic society, cherishes, such as civil rights, international law, or stuff like that. Some form of counterterrorism policy led to the fact that the terror attacks have shifted away from, let's say, the United States to other places. Is that part of our values that you want to preserve? So that's another question that we can estimate how effective is a policy, how likely it is to be a successful one. So those are 4 different ways that some of the research allows us to think about measuring effectiveness of different counterterrorism policies and looking at the objectives. I want to look at the list. This is a list from the book based on the study from 2006 study on different types of strategies, tactics that are intended to fight terrorism. And I want to think about them in the context of the different objectives that we can think about in this case. So for example, you see here that's the 3 policies that are circled are airport screening, CCTV, which is a television, video feed from cameras, from security cameras, and metal detectors. Those are different measures that are focusing on reduces the chances of attacks using either firearms or explosive devices in public places. Arrest, military intervention, overall using of force are intended to harm the capacity of groups and reducing the number of operatives that can actually execute the attack. So that's another category of strategies that has its own objective. The use of psychological measures, community and NGO initiatives and educational program focusing on the prevention of radicalization and prevention of attack, identifying those that may actually go through this radicalization process and join groups, and mostly offering alternative and non-violent channels to express their grievances. And lastly, there are UN resolutions, conventions, bilateral or multilateral agreements, which have the main objective of fostering cooperation, coordination globally in some kind of efforts to fight terrorism, which includes sharing of intelligence, sanctioning suspects or some individuals or groups, and sharing the lessons of successful methods. So those are just a couple of examples for the wide variety of counterterrorism strategies that we have, and what are the different objectives, the way that we conceptualize those different objectives. All right, so what do we have in terms of research on counterterrorism? So most of the findings are not very encouraging. So for example, if we look at if we go back to the list that I just showed you a minute ago, so punishment, fortification are not that effective in preventing terrorism. The use of force in terms of military intervention has usually a negative short-term effect, such as we had some of those evidence in the studies of Canada and stuff like that. And the long-term effects are not very clear. The use of international organizations such as UN in many cases are not very effective. And if we're talking about changing the political context in which terror groups and individuals operate, it's suggestive, it's uncertain, it's very, very context dependent. So just as the sentence at the top of this discussion says, a lot of the research does not show encouraging finding in terms of the effectiveness of counterterrorism methods. Now, just to give you a sense of an example of what are some of the trade-offs or some of the risks that are facing when we're talking about implementing different counterterrorism policies. So one of the famous cases is the CIA pursuit of Bin Laden. So there was a plot that was intended to administer fake vaccinations in Pakistan as part of the effort to track Bin Laden. When the plot was revealed, it has a lot of negative effects, especially from the Pakistani society standpoint, from a global health program standpoint, which is unfortunately very, very relevant to our current global pandemic that we're facing right now. So there's a lot less trust by the Pakistani population in global health programs, in vaccinations. There was actually targeting of Western health workers in 2010 attack where 9 of them died. More broadly, the vaccination program in Pakistan, especially for large diseases such as polio, was suspended, which was a major health setback. So again, this is just part of the trade-off when you decide to engage in those kinds of policy measures in order to address terrorism, but this is some of the costs that might be related to that. So this is part of the trade-off and the decisions they need to make. Now, when we are talking about the many different counterterrorism policies that exist out there, there's a lot of ways to unpack them in order to learn a little bit more about what is the objective, what is the problems, what is the benefits of each one of them. So this is what we're going to do in the remainder of today's lecture. So the first type of separation is to unpack them between what's called the use of hard power versus the use of soft power. So the use of hard power, which includes different policies that deploy what's called tangible sources, military forces, police forces, in order to attack, punish, and deter potential terrorists and their supporters. This is an approach which can be defined as an enemy-centric doctrine, which intended to isolate and destroy terror groups and their supporters, of course. And the main tools that are used are military forces. Joint strikes is the most famous one of the last 10 or so years. More policing within states, and increase in intelligence operations. So that's that's the use of hard power as part of counterterrorism policies. The alternative is using the soft power. Soft powers are more indirect tools that focus on what's called population-centric methods. In this case, we're targeting the underlying factors that enable the radicalization and the fact that people join terrorism and participate in terrorism. And these methods, and we'll talk about them in the next lecture, mostly are different capacity building initiatives, stemming of financial flows, and economic development, and countering any kind of radicalization process. That includes actions such as negotiation with perpetrators, adjusting the political context, and other types of studies. So we're focusing for the remainder time that I have for today on hard power. How do we use hard power as part of a counterterrorism policy? And we further disaggregate this one by looking at indiscriminate versus discriminate measures. So the first within this hard power category is indiscriminate repression. The objective is pretty clear in this case: impose cost on the perpetrators and offer benefits to those that abstain from violence or shift away from violence. And one of the central aspects in this case is involve different measures that actually represent coercion and punishment. This is a rational view on counterterrorism. That means that if the cost that we are able to impose on the suspects or on the supporters, the cost of engaging in terrorism are high enough, it should make those individuals, whether if we view them as rational individuals, to shift away from participating in this kind of acts, because it's no longer maximizes their utility. And this is part of the explanation which informs deterrence theory. We're trying to create some kind of deterrence. Deterrence in this case can be either a discriminate or indiscriminate repression policy. An example for a discriminate policy is Israel's house demolitions during the Second Intifada, and we'll get back to that at some point. The focus of the discriminate type of deterrence is known perpetrators of terrorism. We're focusing on those kinds of individuals and placing the entire, all the weight of the policy on those individuals in order to reduce the extent of further terrorism by others. Indiscriminate deterrence in this case is targeting the individuals who have yet to commit any crime or any kind of breaking any kind of laws. The evidence shows that determinate actions, in a way, just as the example from Israel, is able to deter further terrorism. But when the repressive action is indiscriminate, it usually backfires. They do not reduce the degree of terrorism, since mostly because the population, because it's indiscriminate, so we're targeting the entire population, they view those actions by the government, those counterterrorism actions, as illegitimate, which means they're actually more likely to support the terror group. And there's some evidence for that, also not just from the Israeli case, on a more global scale, some studies that look at repressive policies and whether they violate some human rights, they actually lead to the increase in support of terrorism, again, since it alienates the local population from their government and incite more conflict and more support for the terror group. So that's one way to look at that. Another aspect, another type of policy category with this indiscriminate action is mass surveillance. So I talked about it a lot when I talked about the context of the civil, national security, civil liberties debate. The global war of terrorism since 2001 have, in a way, reshaped the way that the public perceives those kinds of methods. There are more invasive methods that are implemented here in the US, such as collecting fingerprints for any visitors or immigrants, and collecting additional private information, which is stored in different federal databases. The criticism in this case, because it's mostly an indiscriminate act, it's not focusing on specific population, is that there's severe damages, of course, to civil liberties. It has a substantial normative costs. And again, I'll try to get you back to the discussion about the civil liberties and national security debate, because the government overall is supposed to be responsible to ensure that we as citizens are able to have our privacy rights secured, even though there are threats of terrorism. But in this case, once we're changing the debate and talking about how the government might break and may violate our human rights, this is a different discussion in this case, which makes it a lot harder. But this is another type of policy. Before I'm moving on to the main and the most famous indiscriminate policy action in this case, using hard power, I'll stop for the attendance word of today. So attendance word today is ice cream. Ice cream is the attendance word of today. So the main indiscriminate policy action is the use of military intervention. The logic behind these kinds of policies, such as the one that guided the American government after 9/11, is to preempt the global reach of terrorism by killing and apprehending terrorists in their safe havens and eliminate their resources in order to prevent them from executing attacks. So that's why we're using military forces and in a very large amount of military forces for an intervention in places where terrorists are hiding. The evidence is very, very questionable. Studies have shown that the onset of the a global campaign against terrorism actually led to a very substantial increase in the number of attacks globally. So this 74% figure is from a study from 2009. And this is part of what is described as the escalatory effect of military intervention. And in addition, and we've talked about it a little bit in the past when I talked about different policy actions, there's some things that are added to those interventions in the way that the local populations views the military intervention in their country just to stop terrorism. And the example that made the situation in Iraq, for example, much worse is the controversy in the Abu Ghraib prison, which if you're not familiar with, you can go back and read. This is the way that American soldiers treated Iraqi prisoners, which was a very controversial issue at the time. So this is the list of options when we're talking about indiscriminate part of how to power counterterrorism policies. Another one is discriminate repression. Within this category, the most prominent policy action is the use that I've mentioned today already, targeted killing or leaders decapitation. Most studies argue that the method is not very effective in coercing the terrorists to halt their attacks, but there's a lot of issues regarding the evidence for those studies. First, there is not a lot of studies which are more systematic in terms of studying multiple contexts and does allow us to get general conclusions regarding how effective that is. Most of those studies are focusing on very specific locations, again, which makes it much harder to generate more general inferences or general conclusions. And coming back to the first part of the discussion today, there's all those studies are using different measures of effectiveness, which in turn affect the way that we make any kind of subsequent assessment, what kind of data that we're using, how do we conceptualize success, and what that means to our conclusions. But still, there are some evidence for successful or unsuccessful use of targeted killing. So for example, successful cases. One is the demise of the Shining Path, which was a terror organization in Peru, or the demise of the PKK, which again is the Kurdish rebel group in Turkey. But in both of those cases, the leaders of those groups were not actually killed, they were captured. So again, it comes back to the studies that I mentioned earlier, the Price study, that if we're able to lead to a turnover in leadership, we might be able to lead the group to its demise. We don't necessarily have to kill the leader. We can maybe just capture him. At the same time, the LTTE, the group in Sri Lanka, was eradicated only after the leader in 2009 was killed by the Sri Lankan military forces. So there's different examples for that. A less successful use of targeted killings, we can go back to the American campaign against Al-Qaeda, especially the killing of bin Laden. So bin Laden was killed in 2011, and a lot of studies since then, a lot of experts since then, and we talked a little bit about this last week when I talked about Al-Qaeda and ISIS, showing that Al-Qaeda did not lose a lot of its operational capacity and its ability to attack the West since bin Laden was killed. The relative failure, if we want to call that, for Al-Qaeda to make a large-scale attack in the West since bin Laden was killed can be attributed to multiple other factors. One of them can be the overall global campaign against the group, not just the killing of bin Laden, the civil war in Syria, which had a lot of effects on terror groups over in that area, and the rise of ISIS, of course. One of the crucial factors that some of the studies have been able to identify with the effectiveness of using litter decapitation is the structure of the group, of the organization, I'm sorry. Groups which are more hierarchical in their structure are more sensitive to this kind of policy method, because once you remove the leader, the group is less likely to survive. At the same time, groups which are more have a decentralized structure and they are more network-based, has a lot of leaders, a lot of clusters for supports, are much more immune to these methods. And this is one of the main features that characterizes terror groups, especially in the Middle East, over the last couple of years. So that's part of this discussion. Within this policy of targeted killings, the most prominent measure used is the use of drones. And that's part of the discussion which I will expand much more in Wednesday's lecture. So one of the most important questions when we're thinking about the use of armed drones is how can we distinguish between the suspects and those who are non-combatant, especially since the vast majority of attacks using drones, using this tactic are executed outside of the active war zone. So there's a lot of civilians and non-combatants in those areas, and how can we distinguish between them? And this leads to some of the conclusions regarding the effectiveness of it. So Audrey Cronin, which is one of the experts of terrorism, has argued in 2013 that there's a lot of costs that are related to the use of drones as part of the policy. It further alienates the population to the efforts made by the local government, especially as well as the United States and the cooperation with the United States. She argued it had no effect on defeating Al-Qaeda. It did not interrupt either recruitment, training, planning, all those different aspects of terror organizations did not suffer too many damages because of the use of drones as part of the targeted killing campaign. And it involves violations of a lot of human rights and potential violations of sovereignty of states, because we're using American tools, not always notifying the local states that we're using those tools than what we're about to do. So that's problematic. At the same time, Byman provided some counter evidence for that. He argued that these tools are actually effective. They deny sanctuary for perpetrators of terrorism, killing some of their prominent leaders. He also talked about other benefits, the relative low cost that involved with using those tools, and the high precision weapons that are used as part of using drones, which reduces substantially the extent of civilian casualties. So this alienation of the population is much less likely if you're doing targeted killing with armed drones. So that's part of the discussion for that. So that's just the first cut, talking about the issue of counterterrorism. We'll talk more on Wednesday. And so that's what I have for you today. Please stay safe. If you have anything that you need from me, you're more than welcome to send me an email. And I'll remind you that later today you will get the link and the email for the extra credit assignment. So have a great day.